And let me have the great honour of introducing Lindy Klein from the Australian College of Nursing. I've worked a lot with Lindy, so it is a real honour to have Lindy here sharing with us today. She certainly knows her stuff and about Moodle, and has used Moodle in a lot of different environments and situations. And certainly if you've caught any of her previous sessions, you know there's been a lot of discussion. She invokes a lot of conversations, which is great. So Lindy, absolute honour to have you here. Really appreciate your time today. So thank you.
Shane, thank you for that lovely welcome. I'm always happy to play with the Pukunui peeps, and iMoot is just an awesome event to be involved with, so thank you for having me. Those of you who've joined in this session, thanks very much for coming. I know you're coming from all over the place, and some of you are up quite late, some of you may be up quite early, so thank you very much for joining in. This is a repeat version of this session, so I'm going to be stepping through how to tailor roles in Moodle. We're looking at some specific roles that we use at ACM and why we use them the way we do. And you'll find in the course presentation space for this session that there's a document there on how to tailor the silent student role. And that's pretty much a step-by-step guide to how to tailor a role from scratch. So hopefully the stuff that we look at in this session, you'll have a chance to actually look at in a more how-to framework if that's what you prefer. I am keeping an eye on the comment stream, so if you've got comments or questions along the way, please feel free to post them. I do tend to get distracted by comments though. Yeah, awesome polygons. We love the polygon. Cross-sectional representation and all that sort of thing happening in the icon of the polygon. Shane's already done my introduction. At the moment, I'm an instructional designer or kind of combined LMS admin at the Australian College of Nursing. We have 2 Moodle sites, so double the Moodle and double the fun. There's some interesting stuff happening on both of those sites, but they are quite different personalities. And I'd like to just double check what kind of background I've got in the room here. So are you admins, are you teachers? A couple of you I know. Oh yeah, I've been the Moodle chick for a long time, Frankie. Have you done much admin work on Moodle sites? Have you had an opportunity to tailor roles? Have you been a frustrated educator who's been trying to manage your students a little more effectively? Joshua, that pretty much sums me up as well. Developer I'm toying with at the moment. I'm trying to find my feet in that space. So feel free to keep typing that in there. Unlike Joshua, I'm mostly admin kind of systems maintainer at the moment. So you're a frustrated nerd, I think, Shane. Deborah says she's been moving for a while, but no admin, and we're about to upgrade and add Mahara. So, oh, lots of fun changes afoot there. Mahara is a whole lot of wonderful space to play in. I do miss having Mahara time. And upgrades, what version, Deborah, are you changing from and to? If you can put it into chat, that would be cool. So while Deborah's chatting away there, consider this statement. The people undertaking studies of your course offerings are all students on Moodle. Do you think this is accurate? If you think it's accurate, just type Y into the chat. Okay, so there's a couple there. It's a trick question. It's deliberately a trick question. It's more accurate to say everyone is first a user on Moodle and is then assigned a role. So everyone starts off being an authenticated user. Yeah. Because until they've got the swipe card to get into the building, they can't get into the classroom. And I do like using those kind of real-world analogies because our online spaces can get a bit hard to visualize in terms of how people flow through them, but I find that one's quite a useful analogy. Authentication is that process where you give them a username and a password and an account that they can access the site with, but enrollment, pardon me, is that process where you specifically give them access to an allocation of courses. Thank you, Frankie. And yes, I find metaphors are crucial when I'm training as well. They help people get a sense of what you're talking about. Otherwise, you're just not making much sense at all. So once a user has an account on Moodle, you can give them a role in multiple contexts. In this slide, we're talking about the course context, because that's the one that we're usually most interested in. Students are usually enrolled into a course. But did you also know you can enroll users into a course without giving them a role? You can just select none. You can also give access to users to a course without actually enrolling them. So we're going to look at two different ways of doing that. I find there are some useful points for that, but it does present some challenges. And yes, it can mess you up if you're not paying attention to what you're doing. So Joshua quite rightly noted. The ability to give a user access to a course when they're not actually directly enrolled in it is usually because they've got a level of access at either the course category or the whole site context, which flows down into that course. So if you're seeing someone can access stuff but they've got no role in the course, you need to look at the other users section. So if you go into the admin block, course administration users, you'll find a drop-down link for other users. And that will show you people who've got access as a manager or a course creator or some other site or course category-based context. You can also enroll users directly within courses. You can allocate users roles within individual activities and resources and within other users. That last one has a tendency to really mess people up. You would allocate a parent role in a child user. So for example, from a primary or high school perspective, you might say this parent needs to see what their child sees on the site. So we're going to give them a parent role in their child's user. That mentor-mentee relationship is pretty much the only time you're going to allocate roles within that user context. But I do see, or used to, see people allocating roles in the user context when what they wanted to do was give this user this role in a broader context. It's really easy to trip over, so please be careful with it. I'm assuming most of you have some either access to an admin or some admin experience yourself. So do remember, if users are going to access things within a course, they've got to have access to the course somehow. They're either enrolled into the course or given a role, so added to the course but given a role at a resource or activity level, or they've got that higher course category or site-wide context access. And conversely, if you assign a role at course category or site-wide context, your permissions are going to flow on. So if you've given someone a student role at the site-wide context, they're going to be a student in every course on your site. And sometimes that's appropriate. I have worked on sites where that's exactly what they wanted, but most of the time it's not. So I find this graphic kind of useful to keep in mind when I'm trying to work out where people should have this kind of level of permissions, remembering that permissions flow from that widest context all the way down to the smallest. The only point I need to make out with this diagram is the user is kind of at the pointy end of the pyramid, but actually they can be just as broad as site-wide, because wherever that user can see, so can the role that's allocated in that user context. It gets a bit messy. It's a little beyond the purview of this particular presentation, but there's a lot on Moodle Docs on it. And of course, I'm more than happy to follow up questions when they're directed to me on Twitter. I do get inundated from time to time though, so if I'm a bit slow, please feel free to repost your question at a later time. Okay. So I've been talking about assigning roles in context, but we kind of need to understand what a role is. And at a technical level, it's a collection of capabilities and associated permission levels. So a capability is a thing you can do. Permission level is the level at which you can do it. Let's see if we can find a metaphor for this. When I take my daughter out to the context of a restaurant, she is allowed to eat, but not with her fingers. So the capability there is eating. The permission level is with fingers not allowed. Hopefully that gives you a sense of where this is going. There are approximately 400 defined capabilities on a standard Moodle install, and you get even more the more plugins you add. In fact, a really good guideline, if you're installing a plugin as an admin, once you've finished the installation process and whatever customized settings you need to do, go and look at the permissions for that plugin and work out whether they're set at the defaults that would actually allow you to do what you want on your site. So we had the suite of Turnitin plugins added to our site a while back now. When it first got started, I removed the ability for the teacher role to do anything with Turnitin, because as we were rolling it out, we needed to test it a little bit more before our educators started using it. And they were so keen to use it that I knew they weren't going to wait for the testing. So I did need to do the last round of testing in our live environment, not with live students. I couldn't let the educators have access to it until we'd finished. So that's the kind of situation where you need to be mindful of what's going to be the flow-on effects. If you leave that plugin installed with everyone having full-level access, is that going to cause you headaches down the track? No. So this is a snippet from the Define Roles page. When you start going in, you define a role, you add a new role, you're going to get a list of permissions, about 400 on the page. It is a scroll of death. You need to click the Show Advanced button to be able to see the full level of permissions that's showing across here. So what we've got is not set, allow, prevent, and prohibit, and a column for risks. Most of the permissions, I am generalizing, but most of them don't have a lot of things happening in the risks column. But you will see from time to time there are icons there, and they give you an indication of, oh, this could be dangerous if you allow it at a broader level or at a broader context. If you click on those icons, you'll find you get a little more description of what the risk actually entails. But bear in mind, this area of Moodle is really written for and from developers, so it can be a bit scant on detail for the non-developer admins among us. If you're really not sure, post up a question on Moodle.org. There are plenty of people there who are really keen to help. It doesn't hurt to kind of ask before you go changing. So not set simply means that capability really doesn't have any purpose in the context of this default role. You might want to change that if you're tailoring the role to another purpose. The reason it might not have sorry, stop and breathe. The reason it might be not set within that default role is that default role can't access an area where the capability would actually be useful. So there's no point having a student role that can create an admin bookmarks block, because they're never going to get to an admin area where they could add that block. Allowed is pretty straightforward. It means that they can do it, unless they are in a role that has prohibited for that capability set. So this is where it starts to get tricky, because users can have multiple roles at any given time. If I, for example, working at ACM, we have course coordinators and tutors. Tutors should not be able to edit directly into our grader reports. We've tried that, it doesn't work for us, so we don't do it anymore. Coordinators, on the other hand, do need to be able to edit directly into our grader report for various reasons. Some of our coordinators are also tutors in other courses. Sometimes they're also tutors in their own course. So if we set prohibit on the tutor role for editing in grader report, it's going to stop our coordinators from being able to do that as well. What we needed to do was set prevent on that capability for our tutors and allow for our coordinators. Thinking through how your roles are going to layer up is really important. I can't stress it enough. Inversely, the prohibited functions can actually mean you've got a lot more control over what roles can do in detailed contexts, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Kind of just covered this, but it's nice to break it down a bit, and this presentation slide deck is available from the course shell after the session, so I'm happy for you to go through, share it with whoever you need to. When you're tailoring or creating a role, these are my key questions. What does this person need to access? So is it a resource? Is it a course shell? Is it a whole category of things? And what access do they need? Do they just need to look at stuff, or are they going to need to go and edit stuff? And that really does guide what you're going to be doing with creating a role. So for administrators, because I've been caught out by this more times than I'd like to admit, when you're creating a new role or you're revising an existing one, make sure which roles can assign this new role. There's nothing worse than creating a new role and not being able to assign it to anyone. Understand that admins by default can assign any role they create, so that's fine. But you may be sharing this responsibility with managers across the site. So if the manager role can't assign the new role you've created, that's going to be a problem. Which roles can switch into this new role? So who's going to be able to see from this role's perspective? And which roles can override this new role? Which roles are going to be able to say, actually, yes, I know that the admin said that this role is prohibited from doing this, but I want them to be able to do it in this context. So quite recently, I created a new role for markers on the site, which a couple of our managers need to be able to assign, and I completely forgot to allow the manager role to assign it. It was quick and easy to resolve, but it caused them about 5 minutes frustration while they went, well, I can't see it. I know it's here. Why can't I see it? Just keep in mind, though, I have really good relations with the managers of our organisation. So when I say to them, look, you really need to make sure you don't assign that role in that context, or just let me know if you're doing it that way so we can make our data match up in our other systems, they're fine with that. When we first started out, we didn't have anyone who was a centralised Moodle admin. The instructional designers were largely the ones pushing for moving on to Moodle, and they took on the role of looking after the site. But because there were only a very limited number of them and a lot more educators, the educators became responsible for enrolling students into the courses. This has now changed because our student management system was getting out of sync with the enrolments that were actually on Moodle, which meant our tutor payments weren't being processed effectively because we couldn't see which tutors were responsible for which students in Moodle when they'd been allocated other students in our user management system. As an admin, it is much, much harder to give access to stuff and then have to take it away than it is to not give access to stuff and then allow it at a later date. So some thinking at the start and some planning at the start can make things a bit smoother later on. Otherwise, you're going to deal with a bit of resistance when you start taking things away. Nobody likes losing their toys. Switching roles can be a bit buggy. So we've got teachers who would switch into the role of student, but because the roles are stacking and the student role is being applied to that teacher, not a generic student account, things like conditional activities wouldn't play properly. Because the educator had already been in and met some of the conditional release requirements, they're going, oh, students can see all this stuff, but I've set it so they shouldn't be able to see it until X. So what we needed was a test student account for each of our educators, so they can go in now. They can log in on their test account, check things from scratch. They can log in on their coordinator account and do what they need to do from that perspective. So managing testing of stuff can be a bit frustrating for everyone involved. At the moment, we're managing it at ACM with each educator having their own test account. That seems to be working. We did have a generic amount of test accounts a little while back, and they started coming up in courses that they really shouldn't have been in. So we kind of, particularly given those generic accounts had generic passwords, that was more of a problem. We've stopped that. Yes, Frankie, but only if you're testing specific elements of that student role, of that course page contents rather. If it's conditional access or there are other things at play there, it can be more useful to just have a clean student account. An example of this is testing some of the Turnitin functionality recently. Once a user had agreed to the Turnitin end user licensing agreement, they weren't presented with it again. So I had half a dozen odd clean accounts that could either agree or not agree to Turnitin and use a licensing agreement to test the flow on from those points. Yeah, it's a nicety, but it can be a bit problematic. So moving on to overriding roles, and this is actually a really cool feature, but from a support perspective, it can drive you nuts. A really good example is an educator wanting to allow students to rate posts on a forum. By default, the student role can't rate posts on a forum. So this teacher role comes in, and on the permissions for that forum, they go, the student is now allowed to rate, which is great. Everybody's happy. The problems start to sneak in where teachers adjust to not allow students to do something that they expect to be able to do, or allow it but only in this context, so that when students come to a similar looking context, they expect to do it there as well. Yeah, Deborah and Frankie, if you've got a test account, enrolling that from scratch can be a lot more effective for testing everything. If it's just to get a sense of how the page looks, switching is fine. So we're very careful with what roles are allowed to override other roles on our site, and to what extent they can do that. So it gets a bit tricky. I don't like being a punitive admin. I like to encourage educators to be creative and to, do engaging things with students. There have been times where we've had to curb that a bit, because when you've only got 2 to 4 people working on support desk for 2,000 odd students, it just becomes overwhelming. So you've got to be able to realise your own limits within your organisation. So let's look at some real roles. I love getting hands dirty with this stuff. What's the difference between a writer, a tutor, a coordinator, and an instructional designer? Quite significant, actually. So at ACM, we contract writers who are experts in their field, and they write a lot of the content for us. We have a content reviewer process that stuff, and then it goes up into our Moodle site. But our writers might be writing for subjects that are being added into new graduate certificate programs, or being added as a component of one larger course. So it really helps for them to be able to see how their content relates to everything that's already there. It also really helps for them to be able to access the resources that have been used across the other courses, both so we don't breach copyright, because we want them to know, no, this has already been used, we can't double up. And so they get a sense of what resources are out there and can be used to support their content. So what does a writer need to access, and what level of access do they need? Actually, does anyone want to hazard a guess to some of those questions? No. Fair enough, Justin. Moving on. No, it's all good. Each of our graduate certificate subjects is one of 4. So the writers need access to the other 3. They need viewing access. We don't want them to edit anything that's up there, and we don't want them interacting with students. So preferably they shouldn't even be able to see the students. They do sign confidentiality agreements, but we try and keep student information for only those people who actually need to see it. So the best way to create this role: do we edit an existing one, or do we build a new one? Keeping in mind that there's 400 odd capabilities involved in building a new one. Okay, so I've kind of thrown in a misdirection there. I like Frankie's response there, build a new one. We opted to create the role based on default guest. No, by edit, I mean edit an existing template role. There's a lot of different opinions on this. I personally don't like editing the default roles in Moodle, because I know those work. If I edit them, I don't know if they still work. So I tend to take a default role in Moodle and copy it, and adjust it to fit what I think might work, and if it doesn't, then I scrap it and start again. The rule of thumb from Moodle.org is start with a role that is lower and build it up. But keep in mind, I mean, you could start with the manager role and allow every single capability in Moodle, you still wouldn't end up with the admin role. Not every capability that can be performed by roles has actually got its own capability line in the Moodle interface. If you need a capability that you don't see there, it's well worth getting on the forums and going, okay, this is what I need, this is why I need it. Can we get a tailored capability that fits that purpose? One such example is the ability to view grades in the back-ended assignment without being able to edit them. And that is now a capability as far as I'm aware. It's one that was requested for an auditor role for an organisation I was aware of a couple of years ago. Okay, so we're moving on to our tutors. A lot of our writers will become tutors, and this screenshot doesn't do it justice, but it's taken from our tutors contract. Basically, tutors are responsible for grading assignments from students, for interacting with them on the forums, for keeping an eye on them and making sure that they're progressing through the course content and understanding it as they go. It's a pretty big role. Yes, I'm sorry about that, Frankie. It's not a good slide. I need to work on that. Tutors don't get to change the course content or the structure. The only way a tutor could add in an extra resource would be to attach it to a forum post. We deliberately asked them not to change any of the resources in the core content for the course. When we first started out, we used a non-editing teacher and found that they started changing the grades in Grader Report directly, and that made all sorts of headaches for us. So it's been revised or refined over time. To create this role, we copied the non-editing teacher role and reduced it back a bit, which is the inverse of what we did for writer. We took guest and boosted it, but tutor is very, very close to non-editing teacher and not so very close to guest or any kind of lower role. So it was much easier to take non-editing teacher and restrict it a bit further. When you do that, there is a risk that you'll leave capabilities turned on that you maybe didn't expect to be turned on for that role. So it is worth testing it out, making sure that it works the way you expect it to. So on to instructional designers. Instructional designers proof content, ensure continuity. I'll leave you to read the rest of the slide, but basically instructional designers provide a quality assurance mechanism. We try and make sure that the activities that are built are engaging without being overwhelming for both our students and our tutors. We try and make sure that the layout of the course doesn't add excessive cognitive load for our students. That's been a challenge, but it's dealt with in a different presentation. IDs generally need to be able to view and edit every course on the site with some exclusions. You'll notice in this position statement there is nothing about Moodle specifically. They need to develop effective learning environments, but it's not kind of specific that they're admins or support staff. So with the ID team, I'm a member of it. Technically, I'm an instructional designer at ACM. There are two other colleagues I work with, but between us, we've kind of split off so that the two colleagues I work with are core instructional designers. They are really good at it. I've got more of a Moodle background than either of them, so I've become more of the Moodle administrator and help desk role. And that will undergo a few more revisions before it kind of gets settled in. So when we started out, I mentioned that the instructional design team, when Moodle got started at ACM, they were really keen. They were the biggest change agents for using online learning. So they became, by proxy, the people who managed the online learning space. And the ID team has had significant changes since we first started with Moodle. Those people have moved on to other roles. The IDs we have are actually instructional designers. They didn't have that background of managing Moodle. So ID, when it started on the Moodle site, they had manager access because they'd been trained as managers. They were kind of expected to look after the site. As we've got new people in those roles that don't have that training, we've had to rethink, okay, what access is appropriate for an instructional designer? It is not one that matches anything in the default roles especially well, but manager came close. So again, we've taken a role that's boosted up a bit high and tried to bring it back down. Another way of doing this would be to take the teacher role and boost it up a bit, because our instructional designers can do some things across the site that the ordinary teacher can't do. So there's two ways of looking at that. I, for convenience, took the manager role and scaled it back a little bit. These days, instructional designers don't create courses or course categories or manage users. Those things are done in the admin capacity so that they match up with our external user management system a little better. But I guess some of the take-homes from this, I'd really like admins especially to focus on what are the challenges educators face in their online learning space, and how do these challenges impact on the management of the site overall. The role that we didn't look at was coordinator. Coordinators are essentially teachers on our site, but there are some things that we restrict them from doing once the teaching period starts. So we've got two different phases for our courses. There's the development stage of things and the no, this has now got live students in it. We are moving towards, once a course has live students in it, no, you can't edit the core documents of that course anymore. You can't change the rules once the players are on the field. So our subject information and assessment books become non-editable by coordinators once the teaching period starts. And that's through changing roles. Once the teaching period starts, the coordinators switch into a role that doesn't allow editing of the book module and doesn't allow editing of the assignment module anymore, because those things should be fixed and done. We shouldn't be changing them once the teaching period is started. Those changes have been difficult to put in place in the culture that's at ACM. We're moving towards educators using their test playground areas more effectively and kind of demonstrating back to instructional design team, this is what we want to be able to do, this is what we think would work for that purpose, can you show us how it would work in our course? But up until quite recently, there's been changes to activities as students were undertaking them, which has led to a bit of confusion and anxiety all around, really. So we're trying to improve our processes as we go. Recognizing that whatever you allow or prevent your users from doing is going to have an impact on the management of the site overall. So if I allow the educators to do the enrollment of students, that's awesome. That means I don't have to. But it then means that my systems for Moodle and for our student management are out of sync. So if I not even accidentally, if I go to update users across one particular course where the teacher has also been enrolling users, I may accidentally unenroll someone that they've only just enrolled. They may accidentally enroll someone that I've just unenrolled because they withdrew or they've ceased doing that course for whatever reason. So finding where your processes are likely to become a bit muddy and trying to make sure that's prevented before it becomes a problem, it's a challenge, an ongoing challenge as a site administrator. Actually, Justin, I layer the roles. So before teaching period starts, they have an editing course developer role, which they can pretty much edit anything. Once they're in the coordinator role, which has prohibits on editing books and forums and assignments from memory, I would have to double check the role because it's been a while since I've looked. Once they're in that coordinator role, they're stopped. They could still have the course developer role, and at the moment that's how it works because I use CSV spreadsheets to upload users into their courses, so it was easier for me to create a role that had prohibits and layers over the top of the editing role, thereby stopping it once the teaching period is started. Does that make sense? Not a worry, my pleasure. It's good to have some questions. So this has been a slightly shorter session than some of the others I've presented, but roles is a really tailored way of allowing access to the things you need people to access on your site. So some of the other roles that we have at ACM include an auditor role, a guest presenter role, a mentoring role, a clinical placements officer role that's responsible for making sure students have submitted all their required documentation before they go off on clinical placement, because we work in health. They need to make sure they've got things like all their immunisations up to date. A content creator role for individuals who work on the course materials but shouldn't be creating activities. So we've got some very tailored roles for the way our site works, and that's come about over time. There's probably 15 to 20 odd different roles there, some of which are now redundant. It can be inundating for new managers or even new admins to see a massive list of roles like that and go, okay, so which one should I be assigning in this context? So remember that the more roles you create, the more confusing it can be for people further down the line. Yeah, it depends on how your organisation works, Deborah. It's quite frankly, had I not started at ACM, they'd probably be using the standard default roles and just making the best of the problems that were coming up from that. I have a real love of tailoring things to make it fit the user. So we have our instructional designers. One in particular really didn't want admin access on the site. She quite specifically went, look, I don't want a level of access that means I can break stuff without realizing it. I don't want that access. Tailor me access that I know I can't break stuff. And that's a perfectly legitimate request as far as I'm concerned. The level of access you give someone should match the level of understanding they're likely to have of the site and what they need to do. But yeah. It has kind of developed in an organic way here as well. It's just I've got a bit more of a background on tinkering with that stuff before I started at ACM. And it's a lot of fun. So the silent student role that's sitting in the PDF document in the course shell for this, that's actually just a bit of fun. I haven't ever had to use that role in anger. I have seen cases where it might have been helpful for a coordinator to have access to a role like that, but fortunately not on any of the courses we've used at ACM. And basically that's a way for a teacher to go, this student needs to be silenced in this forum for a little while, and it's a good way to stop flaming happening on the forums. Oh, Deborah, you've brought up a really interesting point there. So we use marking guides across ACM for all of our assignments. We have 7 standard rubrics that inform those marking guides. We still have, educators that do occasionally develop their own, which haven't been through our quality assurance processes. So any marking guide we use has to go through the assessment and grading subcommittee and kind of be rigorously tested and assured and all that sort of thing. Unfortunately, that means we've got a few rogue marking guides on our site. From a management perspective, I find that really challenging because the capabilities for assignment don't actually restrict the editing of marking guides. So when a teacher creates an assignment, they can choose whatever marking guide they want from the templates, and I've made all the standard ones available as template marking guides, but they can then edit that however they want. And that has proven really quite frustrating. It's been performance managed outside of Moodle rather than trying to tailor the permissions down, because there isn't any way of tailoring those permissions. The capability doesn't exist in a space that we'd like it to. And I've had a real struggle trying to even articulate what kind of capability I'd want there. that can be quite a challenge as well. Yeah, absolutely, Frankie. Everyone matters, and everyone's opinion is a valid opinion, but and I hate saying "but" there, but when you're a professional organisation and you've got over 1,000 or more students, you need to make sure that their experience has some sort of continuity. From my perspective, the most important part of the site is that the student gets a positive experience from it. I don't want that to come at the cost of my educators having a good experience, but the students come first. Justin, that's a really good question. I would like to see an auditor role that's tailored and a little more defined as a default role within Moodle. I think the manager role is a little bit convoluted. It doesn't always fit what you would expect a manager to be able to do, and that's largely because manager differs based on what organisation you're sitting in. I find the course creator role really not that useful because having created the course, they can't do anything in it. They can assign themselves the teacher role, and at ACM, when that was happening, they often had course creator and then they'd assign themselves teacher and then they'd go in and build the course, but it was a bit convoluted. It's nothing that you can't fix as an admin because you can go in and just adapt those roles and make them fit better, but for new admins starting, those default roles don't always fit what they expect them to do. And perhaps that's more training required when you're starting out, I don't know. I'm curious, are there any improvements the participants here would like to see in Moodle roles? Oh, okay, sorry, Justin, I completely misunderstood your question there. I've used the ability to create a role off a legacy role. I can't quite think of the right phrasing there, but I've never tried importing a role or exporting a role out, so I really don't know what improvements I'd like to see in that process. I haven't had the opportunity to test it out thoroughly yet. No, my pleasure. Justin, are you coming to the Moodle Meet in Melbourne? Actually, open that question up. Who is coming to the Moodle Meet in Melbourne that's participating here today? Oh, dang. Oh, shame. No. I think it would really benefit from kind of having a sit down and chat about this kind of stuff, but it is hard when we're spread out all over the globe to get us all in the same space, so kind of trying to open this one up and let people have a talk. Looks like Deborah and Justin need to catch up with each other. If you've got something in common there, that could be cool. Thanks for the earworm, Frankie. That is a really cool idea, Vinny. I think that could be quite useful both ways, though. I would love to see, outside of the management of the ACN site, I would love to see the ability for teachers to get higher and higher levels of permissions. So they often, yeah, exactly. They often start being quite comfortable with forums and assignments. And once they're comfortable with that, then move on to workshop and forums and assignments so that you gradually build that up. Exactly, yeah. Great minds think alike. I've considered it within the context of ACN. At the moment, we've got a lot of other organisational changes happening, so I don't really want to throw too much more onto the colleagues that I'm working with because I don't want to stress them out. What I would love to see, though, is that ability to step them up and to some extent step them back. So if they've forgotten how to use groups in forums, I don't want them to keep having access to setting up the forum. I want someone to be alerted to go and help that person understand how groups and forum posting works before they get left with the responsibility of doing it on their own. I would love that capability as well, but Newsforum has its own set of capabilities, Joshua. Just double check that it's not there. I mean, I should probably assume that you already have. So, yeah, that's really cool, Joshua. With Shane, I'm just not sure if it's got a separate capability for what Joshua's after. I always want to see the announcements on the news forum, hey, because that almost forms part of the course content. The contextual announcements that an educator is making there can be really important to the course content. Oh, you know, I'm going to have to jot that down and have a look now, Joshua. But you've just kind of described the case study for why you would need that capability. It would be a really good idea to go and share that on the forums at Moodle and maybe create a tracker item for it. No, there's post news, which is a specifically news forum capability as well. I'm not sure if there's a view news capability. This is important stuff. We need to check this out. So I'm just looking on one of my Moodle sites now. So we've got add news, reply to news, and add a new latest news block. That's really annoying.
Okay, if it's okay for me to butt in.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, Josh is right. There is only an add and a reply capability for news forums. But just as a thought, why not just override the student role for the whole course, stop them viewing forums, and then just set up a role that only applies to a news forum where you do allow them.
So that everyone the student role just for that one forum.
Yeah,
that would work.
Yeah, so as a default for the course, they can't be forums, and then override the role just for that forum.
Joshua, that sounds like it could be a solution. But it doesn't matter because the parent role still has access to the course. So if you set up that the parent role can't view any forums, and then on each course's specific news forum, you allow the parent role to view that forum, I think you'd have your solution. That's what you mean, isn't it, Shane?
No, I was thinking through it as a student role, but yeah, you'd have to play with it for the parent. I don't know, actually. Yeah. Yep, just don't know.
Moodling. You don't have to change it. No. If you look at the activity, Joshua, and go to the permissions, you can add the parent role to the allowed column for being able to view that news forum in the activity itself, yeah. Thank you, Frankie. It was great to have you here. Oh, thank you.
I might just quickly jump in just to say thanks to you, Lindy, for presenting on the role system, and Frankie probably summed it up very well. It is a very complex system, so appreciate your time in explaining it.
It's fun though. Thank you for having me, Shane. This has been awesome.
Pleasure. And not to chuck anyone out of this, so yeah, keep the conversation going.
No, Joshua, you should be able to add the site-wide or course category-based roles in that activity. You may not. Josh, do you have admin access on your site? Thanks, Vinny. It was great to have you here. Bye, Marin. So, Josh, it may be if you're not an admin that the role that you're sitting in doesn't have the ability to override the permissions for that parent role in that activity. Okay. My pleasure, Deborah. Thanks for coming. Okay. So your teacher account doesn't have that level of override ability. Exactly. It really is layering lots of different things on top of each other to find that needle in the haystack. But that's what gives you so much contextual control over it, which is really cool. Thanks, Justin. It was great to have you here. Okay. See, this is where Shane